My husband laughed while signing our divorce papers. It wasn't loud. It wasn't careless. It was controlled, confident, the kind of laugh a man gives when he believes the ending has already been written. He leaned slightly toward the woman sitting beside him and whispered something I couldn't hear. She covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking as she laughed back. Across the aisle, his mother folded her arms and smiled as if this courtroom were a theater, and she was watching a familiar play reach its final act. I kept my eyes forward. A moment later, his whisper reached me anyway, carried by the stillness of the room. She really thinks she still has money. The woman beside him let out a soft, amused breath. I bet her accounts are already empty. His mother didn't laugh. She didn't need to. Her expression said it all. I was about to walk out of this marriage with nothing, just as she had always predicted. They thought the humiliation was complete. They thought I was finished. The judge adjusted her glasses and asked for the banking disclosures to be prepared. I felt it then, not fear, not anger, but a quiet certainty settle in my chest. This was the moment they had miscalculated, the moment they didn't know was coming. I didn't move. I didn't look at them. I simply waited, knowing that in a few minutes the room would never feel the same again. The courtroom was cold, the kind of institutional cold that seeped through clothing and into your bones. The polished table beneath my hands felt unforgiving, like it was designed to remind people where they stood. Around us, the low sounds of paperwork being shuffled and chairs adjusting filled the silence. No one spoke. Everyone watched. My husband sat comfortably, one ankle resting on his knee, his posture relaxed as if this were a meeting he had already won. He looked like a man who had rehearsed this moment in his head for months. His lawyer leaned in occasionally, murmuring assurances. Across the aisle, the woman who had replaced me checked her phone once, then glanced up at me with a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. I didn't react. If there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that reaction was a form of currency. And I had spent enough of mine already. The judge called the room to order. Her voice was calm, precise, uninterested in drama. She had seen too many versions of this story to be impressed by confidence or charm. She asked for confirmation of assets. She asked about disclosures. She asked questions that seemed routine to everyone else in the room. But I noticed the way my husband's lawyer shifted in his seat, the way his pen paused mid-note. My own attorney remained silent. That was deliberate. Silence had become our strategy. As the opposing counsel began outlining the proposed settlement, I listened as if he were describing someone else's life. According to him, I was a dependent spouse, a woman who had benefited from generosity, a woman who would be adequately supported as she transitioned into independence. The words were polite, the meaning was brutal. They were offering me just enough to disappear quietly. My husband nodded along, his expression benevolent, almost kind. He glanced at me once, just long enough to confirm that I still looked small, still calm, still defeated in all the ways he expected. What he didn't see was the discipline behind my stillness. The judge stopped him midway through his summary. "Before we proceed," she said, "I'd like to review the banking records that were submitted." The woman beside my husband stiffened, just slightly. Her phone slid face down onto her lap. His mother's smile faded into something tighter, more watchful. The bailiff moved, distributing documents. Thick folders landed on the table in front of the lawyers with a dull, final sound. My husband's lawyer flipped the cover open and scanned the first page with practiced indifference. Then he paused. I watched the color drain from his face in stages. Confusion first, then concentration, then something closer to alarm. He turned a page, then another. His posture straightened, his shoulders going rigid as if his body had realized what his mind was trying to deny. He leaned toward my husband and whispered urgently. My husband frowned, irritated more than concerned. He took the folder and glanced down, expecting confirmation of what he already believed. His brow furrowed. He flipped a page, then another. His movements grew faster, sharper, no longer controlled. The room felt smaller now. I didn't look away. I didn't smile. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I watched him the way you watch someone standing on unstable ground knowing they haven't realized it yet. The judge waited, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke again, her voice even, almost gentle. "Mr. Carter," she said, addressing my husband, "I suggest you check your account again." He looked up at her, then at the papers, then back at the screen in his hand. His face had gone pale, the confidence he carried into the room draining out of him like air from a punctured tire. "Wait," he said, his voice hoarse. "This doesn't make sense." The judge met his gaze without sympathy. "It will," she said, "once you understand what you're actually looking at." And in that moment, as the laughter died and the room held its breath, I knew something fundamental had shifted. They had come here expecting to watch me lose. They had come here expecting closure. What they were about to witness was something else entirely. The first time I realized how completely he underestimated me was long before the courtroom, long before the papers and the laughter and the judge's measured voice. It happened quietly, the way most erasures do. We were married for 11 years. From the outside, we looked like a success story. He was ambitious, driven, praised for his discipline and vision. I was the supportive wife, the calm presence beside him at dinners, the one people thanked politely before turning back to him. At first, I told myself that was fine, that we were a team, that not every contribution needed applause. That lie lasted longer than I cared to admit. In the early years, I handled the things he didn't want to think about. Bills, schedules, taxes, appointments. I learned the language of numbers out of necessity, not passion. I balanced accounts because someone had to. I tracked expenses because chaos made him anxious. He trusted me with the mechanics of our life because he believed they were beneath him. What he never did was look closely. When he launched his business, it consumed him entirely. Late nights turned into early mornings. Dinners were canceled, then forgotten. Conversations became monologues about growth and projections and what this will mean for us. Whenever I tried to talk about my own plans, he'd nod distractedly, already somewhere else. "You're good with money," he said once, absently, while scrolling through his phone. "Better than I am. Just keep doing what you're doing." So I did. I opened accounts in my own name, the way my father had once advised me to do, back when I was too young to understand why it mattered. I invested cautiously. I documented everything. Not because I was planning an escape, not because I didn't love my husband, but because stability had always been my instinct. Security isn't paranoia when you've watched women disappear into marriages before. He never asked where the money went. He never asked how it grew. As long as the household ran smoothly and his lifestyle remained untouched, he assumed everything was exactly as it should be. His confidence wasn't based on knowledge. It was based on entitlement. Over time, that entitlement sharpened. He stopped consulting me about decisions that affected both of us. He spoke over me at gatherings. He corrected me in public, then laughed it off as a joke. When I pushed back, even gently, he'd sigh and say I was being sensitive, that I didn't understand the pressure he was under. I learned what battles were worth fighting and which ones would cost me more than they gave. The woman who would later sit beside him in court entered our lives gradually. At first, she was just a name mentioned in passing, then a colleague, then someone whose messages made him smile in a way I hadn't seen in years. By the time I allowed myself to name what was happening, it was already over. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He looked relieved. He told me it had been coming for a long time, that we had grown apart, that I had changed. He said it gently, almost kindly, as if explaining an unfortunate but unavoidable truth. When I asked what he meant by changed, he shrugged. "You're not ambitious anymore," he said. "You're comfortable." Comfortable. As if the life I had maintained, the foundation I had quietly reinforced year after year, were signs of stagnation instead of strength. The divorce moved quickly after that, faster than I expected. He hired an aggressive legal team. He talked about fairness while positioning himself to take everything that mattered. His mother called once, just once, to remind me how lucky I'd been to marry into their family in the first place. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't reveal anything. Instead, I listened. I listened to how they framed me, dependent, emotional, unprepared. I listened to the assumptions they made about my capabilities, my awareness, my worth. Each word told me exactly how they planned to win. And in those months leading up to the hearing, I did what I had always done best. I prepared. I reviewed every document. I confirmed every account. I sat with my attorney and answered questions calmly, thoroughly. I followed the law precisely, even when it meant resisting the urge to move early, to strike back before the time was right. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I was doing the right thing, nights when anger burned hot enough to make my hands shake. But I never let it dictate my actions. Emotion clouds judgment. I had learned that lesson the hard way. By the time we walked into that courtroom, he believed he knew everything about me that mattered. He believed I was walking in with nothing but nerves and regret. He believed the story ended with him standing taller and me shrinking quietly into whatever life he allowed me. Sitting there, listening to his laughter echo softly through the room, I understood something with perfect clarity. The danger had never been losing him. The danger had been letting him define me. And that I had already taken back. By the time the divorce papers were filed, I had already learned the most important rule of survival. Never let the person who underestimates you know when they're right. The months between separation and court were not dramatic. There were no screaming matches, no slammed doors, no tearful apologies. What replaced them was something colder: calculation, strategy, silence that wasn't empty but deliberate. He moved fast, faster than I expected. His lawyer sent over preliminary proposals within weeks, outlining a division of assets that assumed my compliance before I had even spoken. The tone was confident, almost generous, as if they were doing me a favor by not leaving me with nothing at all. I read every page twice. The numbers weren't shocking, they were insulting. According to them, I was entitled to a modest settlement, enough to maintain a reasonable standard of living while I adjusted to independence. There was no mention of contribution, no acknowledgement of the years I had managed finances, stabilized cash flow, covered gaps when his business stumbled early on. In their version of reality, I was a passenger who had enjoyed the ride. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I scheduled my first long meeting with my attorney. I had chosen him carefully. He wasn't flashy. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He asked questions slowly, methodically, as if he were assembling a map piece by piece. "Tell me everything," he said, "even the things you don't think matter." So I did. I told him about the accounts, about the investments, about how they were structured, when they were opened, why they existed. I told him about my husband's assumptions, his lack of oversight, his habit of delegating anything he deemed unimportant. My attorney listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me for a long moment. "They don't know," he said finally. "No," I replied, "they don't." That was the moment the strategy became clear. We wouldn't surprise them early, we wouldn't posture, we wouldn't threaten. Everything would be disclosed exactly as the law required, exactly when it was required, not a day sooner, not a detail less. The truth would be delivered in a way they couldn't dismiss or manipulate. It would be boring, it would be procedural, and it would be devastating. The hardest part wasn't the planning, it was the waiting. I attended meetings where my husband spoke confidently about timelines and expectations. I sat across from his lawyer as he explained, slowly and condescendingly, how divorce worked, as if I were a child being prepared for disappointment. I nodded. I thanked him for his time. At home, I organized my records with surgical precision. Every statement labeled, every transfer documented. I checked and rechecked dates, balances, compliance requirements. I treated it like a job because that's what it was. There was no room for error. At night, alone, the doubts crept in. Not about legality, but about endurance. About whether I could keep carrying this secret without cracking. About whether the satisfaction of watching them fall would be worth the months of restraint. Some nights, I almost wanted to tell him. To confront him, to watch his confidence falter, to reclaim power immediately. But I stopped myself every time. Power isn't loud, it doesn't rush, it waits. The closer we got to court, the more relaxed he became. He joked with friends about starting fresh. He talked openly about future plans, new investments, new beginnings. He acted like a man shedding dead weight, convinced that everything important was already secured. Once, over a phone call about scheduling, he said something that stuck with me. "I just want this done," he said. "You'll be fine. You always land on your feet." It wasn't kindness, it was dismissal. I realized then that he truly believed his version of me, the one who adapted quietly, the one who survived because she had to, not because she was capable. He never considered the possibility that I had been building something of my own. As the hearing date approached, his mother became more visible. She attended meetings. She sat in on calls. She watched me the way a hawk watches a field, searching for movement, for weakness. Her questions were subtle, framed as concern, but they were probes. "Are you holding up?" she asked once, her voice syrupy. "This must be so stressful for you." I smiled politely. "I'm managing." She nodded, satisfied, as if my calm confirmed her assumptions. What none of them understood was that calm was not surrender. It was containment. The night before the final hearing, I slept better than I had in months. Not because I was confident of victory, but because I knew the truth was no longer mine alone. It was documented, filed, waiting. Walking into the courthouse the next morning, I felt something unexpected. Not fear. Not anger. Clarity. Whatever happened next, I would no longer be erased quietly. I had followed the rules. I had done the work. I had trusted myself when no one else thought I needed to. And as I took my seat, listening to my husband laugh softly, convinced the story was ending in his favor, I understood that the most dangerous thing I had ever done was let him believe he knew me. That belief was about to cost him everything he thought he controlled. The first real threat didn't come from my husband. It came disguised as concern. 2 weeks before the hearing, his mother called me late in the afternoon. Her name flashing on my phone sent a familiar tightening through my chest. We had never spoken without an audience before. Every conversation had always been filtered through him, carefully managed, never private. I answered anyway. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. Her voice was calm, measured, almost gentle, the way it had been whenever she wanted something without appearing to ask for it. "I've been thinking about you," she said, "about how difficult this must be." I thanked her. It felt like the safest response. She sighed softly, as if carrying the weight of the entire situation on her shoulders. "Divorce has a way of bringing out the worst in people," she continued. "Lawyers escalate things. Feelings get hurt unnecessarily." I could already hear where this was going. She spoke about family, about dignity, about how public conflict damages reputations that take decades to build. She reminded me that no matter what had happened between her son and me, we would always be connected by history. "And sometimes," she added, "it's better to let go gracefully than to fight battles that don't really serve you." There it was. I understood then that this wasn't a phone call. It was a warning. I told her I appreciated her perspective and ended the call politely, my hands steady, my voice even. I didn't argue. I didn't reassure her. I didn't give her anything she could use later. The next morning, my attorney called. His tone was calm but direct. "They're making a move," he said. "Nothing formal yet, but it's coming." By the end of the day, it arrived. A letter from my husband's legal team, framed as a professional courtesy. They expressed concern that my recent disclosures might complicate proceedings unnecessarily. They suggested that full transparency could be achieved without introducing confusion, so close to the hearing. Confusion. What they meant was exposure. The letter stopped short of a direct threat, but the message was unmistakable. Retract or revise now, or risk consequences later. They hinted at delays, at additional scrutiny, at potential accusations of bad faith. I read the letter twice, then a third time, letting the language sink in. It was carefully crafted, every word chosen to intimidate without crossing a legal line. For the first time since this process began, I felt doubt creep in. Not doubt about my preparation. Doubt about whether they could still find a way to twist the narrative. Whether the truth, once released, would be enough to protect me from their interpretation of it. That night, sleep didn't come easily. My mind replayed every decision I had made, every document I had filed, every silence I had maintained. I imagined worst-case scenarios, imagined walking into court only to watch everything unravel over a technicality. Fear has a way of sounding reasonable in the dark. The next morning, I met with my attorney in person. He listened as I laid the letter on the table between us, my voice steady but my hands betraying me. "They're trying to scare you," he said after reading it, "and it's working because they need it to." He explained the strategy plainly. They couldn't undo what had already been filed. They couldn't challenge the legality of the disclosures without evidence. All they could do was create pressure, hope I'd blink, hope I'd decide peace was worth more than precision. "Do nothing emotionally," he told me. "Respond only through documentation. We stay exactly where we are." There was comfort in that clarity. Still, the pressure didn't stop. Later that week, his mother reached out again. This time, she didn't pretend to be gentle. Her words were sharper, stripped of courtesy. "You don't want to make enemies you can't escape," she said. "People talk. Things follow you." I said nothing. She mistook my silence for weakness. "You think you're protected," she continued, "but courts don't like surprises. Judges don't like women who play games." That one landed. After the call ended, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at nothing. For the first time, the temptation to retreat felt real. Not because I thought I was wrong, but because I was tired. Tired of being watched, tired of being underestimated, tired of carrying the weight of their assumptions. I let myself feel that exhaustion fully, without judgment. Then I stood up. I gathered every document again. I cross-checked every account. I called my attorney with one simple instruction. "We don't change anything," I said, "not a word." If they wanted a fight, they would get it, not through shouting or accusations, but through facts they couldn't erase. The night before the hearing, I saved every message, every letter, every voicemail, not because I planned to use them, but because I understood something fundamental. People who rely on intimidation reveal themselves when it stops working. By the time I walked back into the courthouse, their smiles were tighter, their confidence more forced. They sensed resistance, even if they didn't yet understand its shape. They thought they were still in control. What they didn't realize was that every attempt to silence me had done the opposite. It had clarified my resolve. And I was done retreating. The real work began after they thought they had won. Once the preliminary settlement talks ended, my husband relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in months. He stopped double-checking emails. He stopped hovering over his lawyer's shoulder. He started talking again, laughing easily, moving through the world like a man who believed the threat had passed. That was when I accelerated. While he celebrated quietly, I narrowed my life to essentials. I canceled anything unnecessary. I stopped explaining myself. Every spare moment went into preparation, not emotional preparation, structural preparation. I created a complete inventory of my financial life. Not just balances, but origins, dates, intent. I laid everything out on paper the way an engineer maps a system, tracing each piece back to its source. Personal accounts, investment vehicles, long-term holdings. Each one represented a choice I had made deliberately, often alone, often without recognition. I didn't rush. Speed invites mistakes. Instead, I verified. I cross-referenced statements. I requested confirmations directly from institutions. I documented everything as if I were explaining it to someone who assumed I was lying. Because that was the reality. What surprised me most wasn't how much I had built, but how little of it he had ever noticed. There were years' worth of decisions sitting quietly in my name, untouched by his attention, protected by his indifference. He had believed control meant visibility. He was wrong. The structure mattered. Some accounts predated our marriage. Others existed well within legal separation guidelines. Each complied precisely with disclosure requirements. There were no shortcuts, no gray areas, no favors called in. That discipline wasn't accidental, it was learned. My attorney reviewed everything with me, line by line, his expression unreadable. When we finished, he closed the folder and looked at me with something close to respect. "They're going to be shocked," he said, "but shock doesn't protect you. Precision does." That became my mantra. I triple-checked deadlines, filing windows, notification rules. Anything submitted early risked exposure. Anything submitted late risked penalties. The margin for error was unforgiving. There were moments when the pressure felt suffocating. I woke up some nights convinced I had missed something, my mind replaying documents like a broken record. I'd get out of bed, turn on a lamp and check again, just to reassure myself that reality hadn't shifted while I slept. It never had. The only close call came unexpectedly. One afternoon while sorting mail, I saw an envelope that didn't belong there. The return address belonged to a financial institution I hadn't used in years. My heart jumped into my throat. For a brief, terrifying second, I thought they had mailed something to our shared address. I opened it carefully, my hands steady through sheer will. It was a routine verification request, delayed by a clerical error, redirected at the last minute. Nothing had been compromised. Still, the reminder landed hard. Secrecy requires vigilance. One slip, one misrouted document, one careless assumption could undo months of work. That night, my husband asked me an offhand question. "Did you switch banks recently?" he said, not looking up from his phone. My pulse spiked, then settled. "I moved some things around," I replied lightly. "Nothing major." He nodded, uninterested. "As long as it doesn't complicate anything." That was the moment I understood how deep his blind spot ran. He didn't ask follow-up questions. He didn't care about details. As long as his comfort remained intact, he assumed everything else would fall into place. His arrogance was my insulation. In the days that followed, I finalized the last disclosures with my attorney. The documents were thick, comprehensive, undeniable. There was no drama in them, no narrative, just facts. Facts have weight when they're assembled correctly. Before submitting the final package, my attorney asked me one question. "Are you sure you want to disclose everything now?" he asked. "Legally, you could wait." I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said, "I want the truth on record. Not because I needed revenge, not because I wanted spectacle, but because I was done being invisible, done allowing others to decide what parts of me mattered." We filed exactly when required. No announcements, no warnings. Just compliance. The day after filing, my husband joked about booking a vacation once everything was wrapped up. He spoke about the future with the ease of someone who believed the past was already behind him. I listened without reacting. Inside, I felt something settle into place. Not excitement, not fear. Finality. From that moment on, there was nothing left to adjust, nothing left to hide. Everything was locked into motion, waiting for the one place where it could no longer be dismissed or ignored. The courtroom. They thought the story was already written. They didn't realize the final chapters had already been submitted. By the time the court date was officially confirmed, I stopped thinking in days and started thinking in hours. Everything became measured, timed, controlled. The outside world moved as if nothing significant was about to happen. People went to work, cafes filled and emptied, emails arrived and were answered. But for me, life narrowed to a precise corridor leading straight to the courtroom doors. I rehearsed nothing, that was intentional. Rehearsal invites emotion, emotion invites mistakes. Instead, I focused on condition. Sleep when possible. Eat even when I wasn't hungry. Walk every morning, regardless of weather, just to remind my body that it still belonged to me. The discipline wasn't about strength. It was about steadiness. My husband, meanwhile, mistook my quiet for defeat. He became almost friendly again in those final days. Casual, light. He spoke to me the way people do when they believe the conflict is over and the outcome already secured. "This will be better for both of us," he said once, standing in the kitchen as if it were still his home. "We'll both move on." I nodded, neutral, agreeable. He didn't notice how carefully I kept my distance, how I no longer corrected him, how I let him believe his narrative without resistance. People cling harder to stories when no one challenges them. His mother was less relaxed. She didn't call again, but she didn't need to. Her presence became heavier instead. I felt it in the way she stared during our last pre-hearing meeting, in the way she watched my face, searching for cracks. She didn't find any. The night before the hearing, I laid out my clothes with intention. Nothing dramatic, nothing soft, neutral colors, clean lines. I didn't want to look fragile, and I didn't want to look aggressive. I wanted to look forgettable. Underestimation is most powerful when it's comfortable. I slept lightly but enough. In the morning, I arrived early enough to sit alone for a moment before anyone else entered the room. The courtroom was empty, quiet, stripped of its audience. Just rows of benches and the judge's bench looming at the front like a promise. I sat and breathed. Not to calm myself, to anchor myself. When my attorney arrived, he nodded once, a small acknowledgement that everything was in place. He didn't say anything else. There was nothing left to say. Then they arrived. My husband walked in first, confident, relaxed, his posture loose. He wore the expression of a man who had already accepted congratulations in his head. The woman beside him stayed close, her hand brushing his arm as if to remind everyone she belonged there now. His mother followed, composed, alert, her eyes sharp. She scanned the room immediately, measuring alliances, reading faces. When her gaze landed on me, it lingered for half a second longer than necessary. I met it without reaction. They sat together, whispering occasionally. Laughter slipped out once, then again, hushed but unmistakable. It carried across the room, not loud enough to draw attention, but loud enough to humiliate. I didn't flinch. When proceedings began, the rhythm was familiar: names, case number, formalities. The judge's voice steady, impartial, uninterested in personal drama. My husband's lawyer spoke first. He was smooth, articulate, practiced. He outlined their position with confidence, framing generosity as fairness, dominance as reasonableness. He painted my husband as cooperative, magnanimous. I watched the judge's face carefully. She listened, she took notes, she gave nothing away. Then my attorney stood. He didn't argue, he didn't object, he didn't counter. He agreed. The subtle shift that caused was almost invisible. My husband's smile widened slightly. His mother relaxed back into her seat. The woman beside him leaned in closer, triumphant. Agreement confirmed their assumptions. Then my attorney added one sentence. Your Honor, we have filed an updated financial disclosure in accordance with statutory requirements. That was it. No emphasis, no explanation. Just fact. The courtroom stilled. The judge nodded once and asked for the documents. I felt the air change. The bailiff moved, carrying folders that were heavier than the others. They landed on the table in front of the lawyers with a dull sound that seemed to echo. I watched my husband's lawyer open the folder. I watched his expression shift. First confusion, then concentration, then something else entirely. He leaned toward my husband, whispering urgently. My husband frowned, annoyed more than concerned. He took the folder and flipped through it casually, expecting confirmation, not challenge. Page 1, page 2. His movements slowed. The woman beside him stopped smiling. His mother leaned forward slightly. I didn't move. The judge waited patient, allowing the silence to stretch until it became unbearable. Finally, she spoke. Mr. Carter, she said evenly, please take a moment to review the account summaries listed here. My husband swallowed. He glanced at the screen in his hand, then back at the papers. His jaw tightened. His foot began tapping unconsciously against the floor. This doesn't look right, he said, his voice no longer smooth. There must be an error. The judge adjusted her glasses. I suggest you check your account again. Something in her tone told him this wasn't a suggestion. He did. And in that moment, as his face drained of color and the room held its breath, I felt no triumph, no joy. Only a deep, unshakable calm. Because everything I had built in silence was finally standing in the light. And there was nothing they could do to stop it now. The silence after the judge's request was heavier than any argument. While the courtroom waited, my husband stared at his screen as if it might rearrange itself out of mercy. His lawyer whispered again, too low for anyone else to hear, but not low enough to hide the panic creeping into his voice. The woman beside him sat rigid now, her earlier amusement evaporated. His mother folded her hands tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the documents as if staring hard enough could erase them. I kept my gaze forward. This was the part no one sees when they imagine revenge. Not the explosion, not the collapse, but the quiet machinery underneath. The structure, the discipline, the months of decisions that had led to this exact moment. Every account listed in that report existed for a reason. Some were old, opened long before our marriage, when independence still felt like common sense instead of insurance. Others were newer, built carefully within the boundaries of the law, documented with precision, funded through income and investments that were undeniably mine. There were no shortcuts, no tricks, no hidden transfers in the dead of night. What made them powerful wasn't secrecy, it was legitimacy. My husband had never bothered to learn the architecture of our finances. He had known the surface numbers, the shared expenses, the lifestyle costs. He had never asked where the rest went, never cared how it grew, because in his mind, it didn't belong to him in the first place. Not because it wasn't his legally, but because it wasn't important. That assumption had protected me better than any lock. The judge flipped through the pages slowly, methodically, her expression neutral. She wasn't reacting to shock. She was verifying compliance, dates, ownership, disclosure timing. Her pen moved occasionally, making notes I couldn't see. My heart rate stayed steady. I had prepared for this review more thoroughly than anything else in my life. I had imagined every question she might ask, every angle she might examine. I had followed the rules with a level of care that bordered on obsession. Because I knew what one mistake could cost. If even one account had been disclosed incorrectly, if even one deadline had been missed, everything could have collapsed. They would have accused me of bad faith, of concealment, of manipulation, and they would have done it loudly. That was the real risk, not losing money but losing credibility. My attorney sat beside me, still and composed. He didn't intervene, he didn't explain. He let the documents speak for themselves. This wasn't a performance, it was an audit. Across the room, my husband shifted in his seat, his foot tapping faster now. He leaned toward his lawyer again, whispering something sharp. The lawyer shook his head once, subtly. No, there was no fixing this. The judge paused and looked up. Mr. Carter, she said, do you recognize the accounts listed under Exhibit C? He hesitated. Too long. Some of them, he said finally, but not all. That is consistent with the filings, she replied evenly. The words landed harder than any accusation. His mother inhaled sharply. For the first time since I'd known her, her composure slipped, just for a second. Enough. The woman beside him looked between the judge and my husband, confusion spreading across her face. This wasn't the story she'd been told. This wasn't the ending she'd been promised. The judge turned a page. There is no evidence of concealment, she continued. All disclosures were made within the required time frame. Ownership is clearly documented. My husband's head snapped up. That can't be right, he said louder now. She didn't have that kind of money. The judge met his gaze calmly. The documentation suggests otherwise. For the first time he looked at me. Really looked. Not with pity, not with superiority, but with something close to disbelief. As if he were seeing a stranger sitting where his wife used to be. In that moment, I thought back to all the times he had waved me off. All the times he'd assumed my silence meant ignorance. All the times he'd decided my world was smaller than his because it made him comfortable to believe it. This was the cost of that comfort. The judge adjusted her glasses again. I'm going to take a brief recess to review the remaining materials, she said. 15 minutes. The gavel came down softly, but the sound echoed. People stood, chairs scraped against the floor. The spell broke, replaced by murmurs and hurried movements. My attorney leaned toward me just enough to speak quietly. You're doing fine, he said. Don't engage. I nodded. My husband didn't wait. He reached me in the hallway before I had taken 5 steps, grabbing my elbow with a grip that was more desperation than strength. His skin felt clammy. What the hell is going on? He hissed. Those accounts, those balances, that's not possible. I looked down at his hand until he released me. It is, I said simply. You lied, he snapped. You hid this. I didn't raise my voice. Everything was disclosed exactly as required. He shook his head, pacing now. If you had just told me... I cut him off. You never asked. The words landed cleanly without anger. For a moment he looked like he might argue. Then his shoulders sagged slightly, the fight draining out of him as reality settled in. The manipulation began almost immediately after. "We can fix this," he said. "We can talk. We can work something out." I stepped back. "There is no we," I said. "Not anymore." The bailiff called us back into the courtroom. As we returned to our seats, I felt something shift inside me. Not relief, not triumph. Resolve. Whatever came next, the truth was already on the record. And it wasn't going anywhere. I thought the worst was over once the judge called for recess. I was wrong. The hours between that recess and the next court session stretched longer than any night I had spent preparing. While everyone else scattered into hushed conversations and hurried phone calls, I sat alone on a wooden bench in the hallway, hands folded, posture still. On the outside, I looked composed. On the inside, I was braced. This was the window where desperation turns sharp. I felt her before I saw her. His mother's heels clicked down the marble corridor with purpose, each step measured, controlled. When she stopped in front of me, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Power, to her, had always been about proximity and pressure. "You've made your point," she said quietly. "There's no reason to take this any further." I looked up at her and waited. She leaned closer, lowering her voice as if offering advice instead of a threat. "Judges don't like surprises," she continued, "especially financial ones. You don't want this turning into something ugly." Ugly meant public. Ugly meant scrutiny. Ugly meant consequences she could no longer manage. "I followed the law," I said. She smiled thinly. "That's not always enough." Before I could respond, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her expression tightening, then walked away without another word. The message was clear. This wasn't over. 10 minutes later, my attorney found me. "They filed an emergency motion," he said quietly, "alleging incomplete disclosure." The words hit harder than I expected. Incomplete disclosure wasn't just a delay tactic. It was an accusation, one that could unravel everything if mishandled. My chest tightened as he explained the details. They were claiming that additional accounts existed, that the timing of filings suggested intent to mislead. None of it was true. But truth isn't always what matters first. Procedure is. "They're trying to force a pause," he continued. "If they can create doubt now, they buy time. Time gives them leverage." "How long do we have to respond?" I asked. He checked his watch. "Hours, not days." Fear flickered through me, sharp and unwelcome. For the first time, I felt the edge of something close to panic. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because I understood how fragile even the strongest structure can feel when it's attacked from every side at once. I followed him into a quiet conference room and spread my documents across the table again. We checked, verified, cross-referenced. The process was familiar, but the pressure was new. Every minute mattered. Halfway through, my phone buzzed. A message from his mother. "You don't want to be remembered like this." I didn't reply. Another message followed minutes later. "People talk, especially about women who get greedy." I handed the phone to my attorney without comment. He nodded once and added it to the growing file. "She's trying to provoke you," he said. "Don't give her anything." The motion was thin, aggressive, but thin. They were relying on intimidation, not evidence. Still, responding required precision. One misstep, one emotional reaction framed incorrectly, and the narrative could shift. We worked until my eyes burned and my hands ached. When we finished, the response was clean, factual, unassailable, no arguments, no defensiveness, just documentation and timestamps. We submitted it with minutes to spare. I stepped out into the hallway again, leaning briefly against the cool stone wall as the adrenaline drained from my system. My legs felt heavy, but steady. I had done everything right. Again. That was when he appeared. My husband stood a few feet away, uncertainty written across his face. Gone was the confidence, the ease. What replaced it was something rawer, less controlled. "They're saying you hid money," he said, as if the words didn't make sense even to him. "They're wrong," I replied. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing. "If this gets delayed, if the judge thinks—" "I don't control what the judge thinks," I said calmly. "I control what I file." He stopped pacing and looked at me, really looked at me like he was trying to reconcile two versions of the same person. The one he thought he knew. The one sitting in front of him now. "Why didn't you just tell me?" he asked, his voice lower. "We could have avoided all this." I held his gaze. "You never wanted to know." That ended the conversation. When court resumed, the judge reviewed the emergency motion with visible impatience. She listened, she asked questions, she reviewed our response. The room felt tight, every breath measured. Finally, she spoke. "There is no basis for this claim," she said. "All disclosures appear complete and timely. The motion is denied." The air shifted instantly. His mother's face hardened, her jaw setting in a way that told me she wasn't finished trying. But it no longer mattered. Her influence had limits here. As the judge continued, I felt the weight lift slightly. Not relief, not victory, just confirmation. I had held my ground. As we gathered our things, my attorney leaned toward me. "They threw everything they had at you," he said quietly. "And it didn't work." I nodded. Walking out of that courtroom for the second time, I understood something deeply. This wasn't just about money or divorce or humiliation. It was about control. And for the first time in a very long time, it wasn't theirs anymore. Whatever came next, I would meet it the same way I had met everything else. Prepared, silent, unmovable. The courtroom felt different when we walked back in. The laughter was gone. The casual confidence had evaporated, replaced by something brittle and tense. People took their seats without conversation. The scrape of chairs louder than it should have been. Even the air seemed heavier, as if the room itself understood that whatever happened next would not be undone. My husband sat straighter than before, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking between his lawyer and the judge's bench. The woman beside him kept her hands folded in her lap now, her posture stiff, her earlier ease completely erased. His mother watched the room carefully, her expression controlled but sharp, like someone counting exits. I focused straight ahead. The judge entered and the room rose, then settled again into silence. She adjusted her glasses and reviewed her notes without speaking. The pause stretched. No one dared interrupt it. When she finally looked up, her gaze went directly to the attorneys. "We will continue with the financial review," she said calmly. My husband's lawyer stood quickly, too quickly, and began speaking before she had fully finished her sentence. His tone was respectful, but strained, layered with urgency he could no longer hide. "Your Honor, before proceeding further, we would like to raise an objection regarding the relevance of certain documents submitted." The judge lifted a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "You've already raised that objection," she said, "and it has been addressed." He swallowed and tried again. "Given the complexity of these disclosures, we believe additional time may be warranted to—" "No," she replied, her voice even but final. The word echoed louder than any argument. She turned her attention back to the file in front of her and flipped to a marked section. I noticed my husband's lawyer tense beside him, his fingers tightening around his pen. "This report references several accounts held under independent ownership," the judge continued, "including accounts at institutions not previously disclosed by the opposing party." My husband stiffened. The woman beside him leaned toward his ear, whispering something urgent, but he didn't respond. His attention was locked on the judge now, confusion beginning to fracture into something closer to concern. "These accounts are listed with clear documentation of ownership and timing," the judge said. "Mr. Carter, do you recognize the institution named here?" She read the name aloud. My husband's head snapped up. For just a second, his face went completely blank, as if the word had knocked something loose inside him. I know the bank," he said cautiously, "but I don't have accounts there." The judge nodded. "That aligns with the records." A murmur rippled faintly through the gallery before being quickly silenced by a glance from the bailiff. My husband's lawyer leaned in and whispered urgently, his voice low but frantic. My husband shook his head, once, sharply, as if denying the possibility could still make it disappear. The judge turned another page. "Mr. Carter," she asked, "are you aware of any accounts under your name or authority that would give you access to these funds?" "No," he said, his voice firmer now, defensive. "I would know if there were." "That is precisely the issue," she replied. The room went completely still. My heart rate remained steady, but my awareness sharpened. This was the moment hovering on the edge of collapse, the second before gravity took over. The judge paused, studying him for a long moment. Then she spoke again, slower this time. "I want to be very clear," she said. "The accounts referenced here are not under your control." My husband blinked once, twice. "That doesn't make sense," he said, louder now. "We were married. Assets should be shared." "Marriage does not automatically grant ownership," the judge replied calmly, "especially when documentation indicates otherwise." His mother leaned forward sharply, her composure cracking just enough to reveal alarm. The woman beside him stopped whispering altogether, her eyes darting between the papers and my husband's face. The judge closed the file in front of her and rested her hands on it. "Mr. Carter," she said, "have you reviewed the most recent account access summaries?" His lawyer answered too quickly. "Your Honor, we have concerns about—" "I'm not asking you," the judge said without raising her voice. "I'm asking him." My husband hesitated. He glanced down at his phone, then back at the papers, then up at the judge. His confidence had drained almost completely now, replaced by something raw and unsettled. "Yes," he said finally, "I've reviewed them." The judge tilted her head slightly. "Then I suggest you review them again." A ripple of unease moved through the room. My husband stared at her, then down at his phone. His fingers moved across the screen, slower than before, less certain. His face changed in increments, confusion giving way to disbelief hardening into something like fear. The woman beside him leaned away slightly, as if distance could protect her from whatever was unfolding. "Your Honor," his lawyer began again, voice tight, "we request a brief—" "No," the judge said again. She turned her attention back to my husband, her expression steady, almost clinical. "Please verify the balances and access permissions currently associated with your accounts," she said, "and confirm for the court whether you retain control." The silence that followed was suffocating. My husband's shoulders went rigid. His jaw clenched. He stared at the screen in his hand as if willing it to change, as if this were a misunderstanding that could still be corrected if he just looked hard enough. His mother's hands trembled slightly in her lap. The judge waited. And in that pause, as the truth pressed closer and the room held its breath, I felt no triumph, no vindication, only a quiet certainty settled deeper into my bones. They had begged her not to open the report. They had underestimated what was inside it. And now there was nowhere left to look but forward. The judge didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She adjusted the papers in front of her with deliberate care, aligning the corners as if precision itself were part of the ruling. The room fell into absolute stillness. No whispers, no shifting. Even the air conditioning seemed to fade into the background. "This court has reviewed the submitted financial disclosures," she said evenly. "They are comprehensive, timely, and compliant with statutory requirements." My husband's lawyer froze mid-breath. The judge continued, her tone neutral, almost clinical. She didn't frame what followed as a revelation. She framed it as fact. "The accounts listed under independent ownership are legally documented," she said. "They were established within permissible parameters, disclosed appropriately, and are not subject to division as marital assets." A subtle sound escaped from the woman beside my husband. Not a word, not a gasp, just a sharp intake of air she couldn't stop. My husband leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. "That can't be right," he said. "Those funds should be accessible. We were married." The judge looked at him directly. "Marriage does not confer automatic control," she said, "especially when records indicate otherwise." She paused, then turned a single page. "Mr. Carter," she said, "please check your account again." The words landed like a physical blow. For a moment, he didn't move. It was as if his body needed time to process the instruction. Then he unlocked his phone, his fingers clumsy now, no longer confident. The screen reflected faintly in his glasses as he tapped through menus, his jaw tightening with every second that passed. I watched his face change. First confusion, then disbelief, then something hollow. He refreshed the screen once, then again. The color drained from his face so quickly it was almost alarming. His mouth opened, then closed. His hand began to shake, just slightly, enough that the phone rattled faintly against the table. "That's not possible," he said hoarsely. "There has to be a mistake." The judge waited. The woman beside him leaned in, whispering urgently, her voice brittle. "What does it say?" she asked. "What do you mean it's not there?" He didn't answer her. He couldn't. His mother had gone completely still, her lips pressed into a thin line. She stared at the judge, then at the documents, then at me, as if trying to reconcile something she had never considered might be true. The judge spoke again. "The access permissions indicate you do not control these funds," she said. "You never did." My husband's head snapped up. "That's a lie," he said, louder now, panic edging into his voice. "She must have transferred them, frozen them, something." "There is no evidence of improper transfer," the judge replied calmly. "The accounts were never under your authority." His lawyer finally found his voice. "Your Honor, we object to—" "No," she said, cutting him off without looking in his direction. "You do not." The word echoed through the room. She turned another page, then another, as if walking the court through an equation with only one correct answer. "The documentation shows a clear pattern," she continued. "Independent income streams, separate ownership, proper disclosure, no concealment." My husband pushed back from the table slightly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The sound seemed to snap something in the room. Heads turned, the bailiff straightened. The woman beside him pulled her hand away from his arm. "Wait," he said, standing halfway before realizing he shouldn't. "You can't this changes everything." The judge met his gaze steadily. "That is often how facts work," she said. A ripple moved through the courtroom. Not laughter, not sympathy, just quiet recognition. The kind that comes when an outcome becomes unavoidable. She set the papers down. "This court will proceed under the understanding that the funds in question are not marital assets," she said. "Any further objections on this matter are denied." My husband sank back into his chair as if the strength had been pulled from his legs. His lawyer leaned in, whispering frantically, but the words no longer mattered. The foundation they had built their case on had collapsed. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I didn't look at him. I focused on the judge, on the weight of her words, on the reality solidifying in the record. The judge glanced down at her notes one last time. "We will take a brief recess before addressing remaining matters," she said. 15 minutes. The gavel came down sharply. It sounded final. As the room stirred back to life, chairs scraping and voices rising cautiously, my husband finally looked at me again. Not with anger, not with superiority. With hunger. With calculation already reforming behind the shock. I saw it for what it was. And for the first time I felt nothing at all. Because the reversal was complete. Whatever he tried next would not change what had just been entered into record. The power had shifted. And it wasn't coming back. The courtroom emptied in fragments. People stood slowly, gathering papers, whispering to one another as if volume alone might protect them from what they had just witnessed. My attorney rose beside me, calm as ever, already organizing the next steps. I followed him toward the aisle without looking back. I didn't need to. I felt him before I saw him. His footsteps were uneven now, rushed, the confidence stripped out of them. He caught up to me in the hallway, his hand closing around my forearm with a grip that was more panic than strength. "Sophie," he said, his voice hoarse, "wait." I stopped, but I didn't turn toward him right away. I looked down at his hand until he released me. The hallway felt too bright, too exposed. Conversations echoed off marble walls. This wasn't the private reckoning he wanted, but it was the one he had earned. "There's been a mistake," he said quickly. "That has to be it. Accounts don't just disappear." "They didn't disappear," I replied. "They were never yours." He stared at me as if the words were in a language he didn't understand. "That's not how marriage works," he snapped. "We were a unit." "No," I said calmly. "We were never a unit. You just assumed I belonged to you." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing a few steps before stopping again. "If you had told me," he said, grasping at the idea like a lifeline, "we could have handled this differently. Privately. You never wanted privacy, I said. You wanted control. His expression shifted then, the confusion giving way to something familiar. Manipulation. He softened his voice, lowered it, leaned closer as if proximity could restore intimacy. Listen, he said, we don't have to do this. We can fix it. Think about what people will say. Think about the story. The story you were already telling? I asked. He flinched. We could be powerful, he continued, desperation bleeding through now. Together, we could rebuild, merge things, start fresh. I almost laughed, but the sound never came. This is the first time you've ever seen me as an equal, I said, and it only happened because you lost. His jaw tightened. You're angry, he said, switching tactics. This is about what happened with her. I know I messed up, but don't let that ruin your judgment. Don't tell me what I feel, I replied. You forfeited that right years ago. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. I never meant to hurt you. That's not true, I said quietly. You just didn't care if you did. The words landed between us, heavy and undeniable. For a moment he looked genuinely lost. Not angry, not calculating, just stripped of the version of reality he'd been living in. I miss us, he said softly, before all this. I stepped closer, forcing him to step back. You don't miss us, I said. You miss the woman who made your life easier, the woman who stayed quiet, the woman who absorbed your arrogance and called it love. His face flushed, shame and anger colliding. That woman is gone, I continued, and she's not coming back. Behind him, his mother stood at the end of the hallway, watching. Her face was tight, eyes sharp, already calculating damage control. The woman who had sat beside him in court hovered nearby, uncertainty written all over her expression. This was no longer my concern. I have nothing left to discuss with you, I said. Any further communication goes through our attorneys. He reached for me again, then stopped himself. Sophie, he said one last time, you don't have to do this. I already did, I replied. I turned and walked away, my footsteps steady, my shoulders light. With every step, the weight I had been carrying for years seemed to lift, not all at once, but enough to breathe freely again. Outside, the air was cool and sharp. I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, letting it fill my lungs. My attorney joined me, saying nothing, offering nothing but presence. That went exactly as it needed to, he said eventually. I nodded. Behind me, the doors closed, sealing the noise, the drama, the past inside. I didn't look back. For the first time in a very long time, I wasn't walking away from something. I was walking toward myself. The morning after the hearing felt strangely ordinary. Sunlight spilled across the kitchen counter the same way it always had. The coffee maker hummed. A car passed outside. The world hadn't shifted on its axis, even though mine had. For a moment, I stood barefoot on the cool tile and let myself feel the quiet without bracing for impact. Nothing was waiting to take something from me anymore. I didn't wake up rich in the way people imagine. There was no champagne, no dramatic phone calls, no sudden applause. What I woke up with was space, time, the absence of dread that had once lived in my chest like a second heartbeat. I reviewed the final paperwork later that day with my attorney. We moved through it efficiently, professionally. Numbers were confirmed, dates were set, legal loose ends were tied without ceremony. When we were done, he closed the folder and slid it aside. You're free, he said simply. Free didn't mean untouchable. It didn't mean life would suddenly be easy. It meant something quieter and far more powerful. It meant that my choices were mine again. In the days that followed, I took stock of what I had actually won. Yes, there was financial independence, security I had built patiently, deliberately, long before I ever needed it. But money wasn't the part that stayed with me when I lay awake at night. What stayed was the realization that I no longer needed permission to exist loudly or quietly, to want more or want less. I had spent years shrinking myself to fit someone else's comfort. I had called it compromise. I had called it love. In truth, it had been erasure done slowly enough to feel normal. That chapter was closed now. I heard bits and pieces about what happened on their side, not from curiosity but from proximity, mutual acquaintances, careful messages, rumors that drifted without invitation. His confidence had fractured. His family dynamic strained. The woman who had sat beside him in court disappeared from public view not long after. I didn't celebrate any of it. Their consequences weren't my victory. They were simply the natural result of believing someone else's silence meant emptiness. What mattered was what came next for me. I changed routines first, small things. Morning walks without checking my phone, meals eaten slowly, evenings spent doing nothing productive at all. I let myself feel how tired I had been, how long I had been carrying weight without complaint. Then I made plans. Not the grand performative kind, real ones, thoughtful ones, the kind rooted in respect for my own energy and limits. I didn't rebuild my life out of anger. I rebuilt it out of clarity. One afternoon, weeks later, I caught my reflection in a storefront window and paused. Not because I looked different, but because I stood differently. My shoulders weren't pulled inward. My face wasn't braced. I looked like someone who expected to be here. That was new. I understood then what the whole ordeal had really been about. It wasn't about divorce, or money, or even betrayal, as sharp as that had been. It was about what happens when someone decides your value for you, and how quietly dangerous it is to let them. Strength doesn't always arrive as force. Sometimes it arrives as preparation, as patience, as refusing to disappear just because it's easier for everyone else. I had been underestimated because I had allowed it. I had mistaken peace for passivity. I had confused silence with safety. Losing that marriage wasn't a punishment. It was a correction. And standing there, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, I felt something settle into place that no ruling could ever give or take away. Self-trust. If you're listening to this and something in it feels familiar, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been underestimated in a way that changed you? Have you ever had a moment where everything you thought you were supposed to be fell apart, and something stronger took its place? If you have, I'd really love to hear your story in the comments. Not because you owe anyone an explanation, but because someone else reading it might need to know they're not alone. And if this story stayed with you, if any part of it resonated, take a second to like the video and stay with the channel. There are more stories here about strength that doesn't shout, about justice that unfolds slowly, and about people who stop asking for permission to live fully. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And wherever you are in your own journey, I hope you never forget this. You are allowed to take up space.